Make some copies. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You have a copy at home.
Yeah, yes.
So 5, write down 6. So so last week we started with a timeline that began by people shouting out things that they knew, like Garden of Eden, Cain and Abel, and King David, and Jesus' birth, whatever. And we plotted them on a timeline. One of the things that we found is that a huge percentage of the stories that we know, a huge percentage of the stories that we know actually come from really early. A lot of it is just Genesis, right? Some of it Exodus, but a lot of the stuff that we know about is heavily towards the front, and then there's some stuff a little bit sort of scattered after that. But that also raises the question. That raised the question later in the session of, well, what kinds of things happened that made a real dent in kind of how the Bible came to be, who Israel was as a nation, and the kind of effect that has on Jesus as a Jewish person in Roman times, right? And it's sort of non-trivial stuff. So to review, and you'll see these on the handouts as she passes them out. So there is a timeline that I included. It's a little bit light. If you want a color copy, I can email it to you. And then there's the first page, which was a handout right there on the front. The first page was the one from last week, and we'll just really quickly review that. The first thing to know is that when we say Old Testament, sometimes I'll also say Hebrew Bible, and it's important to know that when we say when we're talking about this, for Jewish people, it's not the Old Testament; it's just the Bible, right? So because for the New Testament, it's not their New Testament at all. They have their Bible, and then Christians have additional texts that were relevant to their community that we call the New Testament. So that's one thing. There's a little note on that.
I have a question.
Yes, yeah.
What about Messianic Jews?
Well, if you're talking about Messianic Jews, there are sort of two types of Messianic Jews. There is the type of Jewish person who is awaiting a Messiah. There's that type of sort of Messianic Judaism. Then probably the most common term, and that's really just a particular belief within Judaism. There are Jewish people who are still awaiting Messiah, but then there are Jewish beliefs and Jewish sects that aren't particularly awaiting a Messiah, but probably when people say the phrase Messianic Jews, often that gets used to mean Jewish people who have kind of identified Jesus as that, but have not, in any way relinquished any part of their identity as Jewish people. So yeah, but it's a tricky term, because if you say Messianic Jews, you could just mean Jewish people who have expectations of the Messiah, which is absolutely part of Jewish belief.
I never heard that word before.
Messianic?
Yeah, it is very commonly used now to specifically mean Jewish people who look at Jesus as the Messiah in one shape or form. But it's not. It's a little tricky.
There's a book called The Rock, the Road, and the Rabbi by Kathy Lee Gifford. Oh yeah. She identifies as a Messianic Jew who does believe Jesus was the Messiah.
Yeah, that's probably the most common usage of the term.
And I don't know if they truly believe in the New Testament or not,
Well, they certainly look to it. That's where most people get their information about Jesus, for sure.
They do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So so speaking specifically now of the Bible, last week we talked about how the word Bible, Biblia, means library, and so it's a whole lot of texts compiled. With a lot of authors writing for very different reasons, with different aims and different literary styles. And we've mentioned how to take the Bible as a whole, and we often do. We sort of say, well, the Bible says this, and the Bible believes that, and the Bible, whatever. And if you say, well, I take the Bible at its word, or literally, or whatever, or people ask, do you take the Bible literally? That's like asking, do you take the library literally? It's a nonsense question. It doesn't mean anything. There are things in there that are not even remotely literal. There are things in there that are, way too boring to be metaphorical, like just legal code and things like that. It has nothing to do with, it's like, well, the Bible's kind of a metaphor. It's not. It says, here's the penalty for this thing. Here's how much you pay. Here's the percentage of whatever that you're allowed to charge, or whatever. It's just too dull to be that interesting, to be, metaphorical. So the Hebrew Bible, taking just the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible is referred to as the Tanakh. The Tanakh, the word Tanakh is actually an acronym, Ta, Na, and K, which is short for the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. And it says there what those are, Ketuvim. The Torah is traditionally called the first 5 books of Moses, and the Nevi'im are the collection of writings by the prophets, about or by the prophets. And in fact, when we were talking about stories of the later, anything past Genesis and Exodus, when we don't know much about the stories or what happens after that, one of the things that we lose out is what on earth the role of the prophets was, because there was stuff happening that they were talking about. And then the Ketuvim, which is a collection of really varied writings. You get things like Proverbs, which is just collected wisdom. You get things like the Psalms, which are mostly song lyrics. You get, things like Ecclesiastes, which is sort of meditations on difficulty in life. And you get things like Job, which is, people have wondered whether there's any historicity to it, but there's a lot of general belief that Job is an extended sort of existential parable about, asking about, again, the difficulty in life. So it's a lot of different writings, the Ketuvim. And then you have the New Testament, which can also be separated into that's 3 different groupings, but in the New Testament we separate into 3 different kinds of literature. One is narratives. So these are just telling what happened, some stuff that happened. And those would be the 4 Gospels, and then you have the Acts of the Apostles. And it's generally believed that Luke, the author of Luke, is also the author of Acts, and that was basically one work, Luke Acts. But so you have those 5. The 4 Gospels and Acts are narratives, just telling us what happened. The Gospels in the life of Jesus, and Acts in the disciples and first generation after, what happened to them. Then you have epistles, which is the same word as our word epistolary. So it's letters, which is the bulk of the books of the New Testament. The majority of the New Testament is letters written by people in the very early church. In fact, Paul is the author of the earliest writings in the New Testament. Yes?
And most of them.
It is most of them, yeah. And so you're right, Paul wrote most of them, yeah. And then you have so we have apocalyptic literature. Now the word apocalypse is Greek for revelation, and revelation is the book. There are traces of apocalypticism in, there are traces of apocalypticism throughout the New Testament, but as I said last week, Revelation is the only one where somebody goes, I had a vision. and they write it down. And it's pretty bonkers and very interesting. Okay, so now that's basically a recap of last week. So let's dive in a little bit to what's in these 3 sections each. Now, if I say I probably won't say the Septuagint or the Pentateuch, but you see on that first page, Septuagint as another term for the Hebrew Bible. There's a very, very early Greek translation that is referred to as the Septuagint. And it was probably the version of the Hebrew Bible, which was originally written in mostly Hebrew and bits of Aramaic. The Septuagint was a very, very early Greek translation. It was probably the version that a great many Jewish people of Jesus' time were most familiar with. Then the Torah, the Greek portion of that is sometimes referred to as the Pentateuch, penta meaning five, the 5 books of Moses. And then we mentioned also that last week that the entire New Testament it's exclusively written in Greek, as we have it anyway. So moving on to the next page. So in the Torah, you basically get 2 things. You get the pre-monarchy histories of the people of Israel. And really, if you go back far enough, it's like all people. So Adam and Cain and the Tower of Babel and these stories that seem to be about really the world and the world's population. Gradually, you find your way into, it sort of narrows in scope to focus on a family. It starts to focus on, one group of people, one family, and then their offspring, and that begins to be the story of Israel versus everyone in the world. And that is before Israel has a king. And the other part of the Torah is the law. And it's the word law is a little bit tricky. It's one way of translating Torah, but a better translation is teaching. I've even heard it, which I think is very interesting, translated as somebody said probably one of the best ways is to translate it the way, which is interesting because before they were called Christians, the followers of Jesus were called the followers of the way. So in a way, or in a manner of speaking, you could argue that like many religious movements, it was an effort at trying to recapture something in a more in a purer form, So like this, and there was a lot of that in Second Temple Judaism, which includes the Jesus movement, where they're saying, here's how you actually do it right. Right? So this is the way to do it right. And so it's interesting because translating Torah as the way is actually a nice little connection to the New Testament. The Nevi'im, the prophets, is when we transition from this period of the judges. Once we're talking about one group of people, Israel, the tribes of Israel, they're in their land and they have tribal leaders, and that they're called judges. But before too terribly long, they have a monarchy. And does anybody remember the three monarchs, the 3 kings of a united Israel? We mentioned it last week.
Yes, we did.
Anybody remember the 3? There were only 3. There were only 3 kings of a united Israel before there was some division in the land.
Saul, Samuel, and David.
Very, very close. Saul, David, Solomon.
Oh, Solomon.
Yeah, Samuel was a prophet, and he was, in fact, he was the last of the judges and the first of the prophets. And we're going to kind of trace this out here in just a minute, so that you can have a visual. But the judges, so the prophets really talk about the various political and military conquests by and of the land of Israel. And only after the monarchy starts do the prophets really kind of begin in earnest, and I'll show you why that is here in a second. And they also trace the sort of various religious responses throughout that time. So, and then I already mentioned that you can see right here the Ketuvim is just various literature. But let's take a look at why the prophets sort of matter here. The story of Israel, it basically starts. It all kind of starts, with like I said, everybody. There's the Garden of Eden. There's Cain and Abel, and Seth, who we mentioned last week, and nobody talks about. But Seth is actually the person that everybody comes when. It's the 3rd child of, or at least the 3rd son of Adam and Eve. So Cain kills Abel, then Adam and Eve have Seth. But so it starts with just kind of everyone, the world. It's just the whole story, the whole shebang. Gradually, the story begins to narrow. You have everything goes bad, and so the flood, right? And gradually, the story begins to narrow down to God saying, you know what? The world is still kind of a mess, but I'm going to focus my attentions. I'm going to get inside the machine and try to do something from inside it, right? And he chooses Abraham. Abraham? He chooses Abraham. And he starts through what are called the Patriarchs. This family, he starts to just develop a covenant. And that's what the Old Testament is also called, the Old Covenant, right? Abraham, Isaac, and he just has this plan for this family. And then their child, Jacob. Does anybody know Jacob's other name?
Esau.
No, that's his brother. Israel. You're cheating. So, in fact, the descendants of Jacob, and if anybody's ever seen Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, Jacob lived in the land of Canaan, fine example of a family man. This is going to be online. Anyway, he, after a visionary experience, more than visionary, it tore his hip out of socket. He wrestles with an angel who kind of alludes to being God. It says the angel, a man appeared to him in the night, wrestled with him all night. There's some language that suggests it was an angel, and then the angel says of himself to Jacob, he says, "You have wrestled with God and prevailed." But he tears Jacob's hip out of socket. So it's very physical, but it could read like it was a dream, a really hectic dream. But he woke up with he woke up with a hip pulled out of socket.
Now, where do we find this story?
That is in, again, Genesis. We're not terribly far in.
Okay.
But the point is that Jacob has 13 kids, 12 boys, and they become the 12 tribes. Now, because, again, if you watch Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, you know that because of the famine, they end up in Egypt. And bad things happen, which necessitates Moses taking them out. So Moses in the Exodus, so we're moving along now, takes them out back into the land of Canaan. They settle it, and it is the land of Israel now, under 12 tribes. Don't touch that, don't touch that. I don't know, it's out there. But I hear your sister crying. Is she okay? Yeah, I hope somebody's...
I think we
Let me make sure.
this too, so we can see the writing.
They're inside now.
Yeah, let me make sure she's okay.
That kid's got lungs.
What?
She really has lungs, I'll tell you.
I think we need to move this because we can't see his writing.
Okay. All right. Sarah's got her. She's okay. Mostly
Do you want
upset with
to
her
see
brother.
your writing? Because we can't see your writing at all on that screen. Okay.
We'll work that out in the future race. Anyway, so they make their way. The Israelites make their way into Canaan, and they take over. And now this is the narrative. There's more to this in terms of what we learned from history about how all this possibly happened. But they make their way into Canaan, and it becomes the tribal land of Israel. So it's still under 12 different distinctions. They're allotted land, according to the 12 tribes. So it turns into tribal Israel, and finally, they want a king. Under the tribes, they have judges who sort of serve, and this is where we get into the role that the prophets had, and why there's so much prophetic literature in the Old Testament, and that it only arises with the monarch. It's because after Moses dies, you heard in the projects that the confirmation kids did, that that after Moses dies, Joshua leads them into Canaan, and they take over the land. Joshua was the first of the judges. He's a leader. The judges serve, and then to get into the lands, and there are different stories of different judges. They are led by people who sort of serve both a leadership, a military, and also kind of a doing like we follow God. It's sort of combined in the judges. There's a priestly role, but there's a priestly class in the land as well. And they serve a priestly function, But the judges both kind of have this, here's what we ought to do, following God's wishes, and military and administrative things like that. It's sort of all combined. But after a handful of generations, the Israelite tribes look around at the lands around them and they go, we want a king. We want a king. Everybody else has a king. I want a king. And they say, and Samuel goes to them, he's the last of the judges, and he says, God, they want a king. And he goes, I didn't want them to have a king. I'm supposed to be their king. But fine, they're whining enough. Give them a king, but warn them, your king will take your men for his military. He will take a portion of your stuff. Ideally, or probably the best portion of your stuff, right? Kind of sounds a little like government. Anyway, so and he says, but this is how it'll be. Like, you will be beholden to this king if you have a monarchy, instead of having smaller groups with me as your head. He's like, fine, I'm just warning you. So Samuel goes back and he's given permission. He goes back and he anoints Saul. He's the first king of all Israel. So now we have a monarchy, and they are fighting off, they're fighting off the neighboring areas. The Philistines is a big one, stuff like that. But what's interesting about this is that the role of the judge splits for a long while. And it's split between the monarchy, who takes over the administrative and the military, and the prophets, who take over speaking for God. There's still a priestly class serving a priestly function in society, but this is where the prophets really show up, is when the monarchy comes in, and the monarchy does its thing, and the prophets go, are we forgetting? Whenever the king says, well, let's just do this in the interest of the nation, they go, the law says this, God wants this. We're not even following how much less are we following the law when we're not even taking care of our own widows and orphans, right? They really have the interests of God in mind, where the monarchy is kind of thinking of earthly things. So that then continues. Let's see, where are we here? That continues until basically Israel loses everything. There are only 3 kings before the kingdom splits over leadership. After Solomon, they're like, so-and-so should be king, and other people are like, forget that, so-and-so should be king. And now you have a divided kingdom between north and south. The north retains most of the tribes, so they also retain the name Israel. And in the south, anybody remember the largest tribe? Who's the largest tribe? They just named themselves that in the south. The kingdom of Judah, exactly. Sometimes they say Judea. So now we have the kingdom of Israel in the north, the kingdom of Judah in the south. And they have different kings, and the prophets continue. When you look at the prophets, they'll kind of tell you, start to get indications that like so-and-so in the north was being awful. And so, in fact, the story of Elijah is the story of a prophet talking to Ahab, who's the king in the north. And the northern kingdom is being led astray by Ahab, who kind of doesn't care, and Jezebel, his wife, who is firmly devoted to some Canaanite gods, right? And so the monarchy, the prophets continue into monarchies of, past the 3. It's both north and south. And they continue to speak as outside powers destroy the northern kingdom, and then really do harm so first it's Assyria destroys the northern kingdom, and then later Babylon really is bad news for the southern kingdom. And then later on...
Prophets are encouraging this? The prophets encourage this?
They don't encourage it, but they do try to make sense of it and explain it as a failure on the part of the people of Israel, both north and south. They try to say, why is Assyria coming in? Because it's God's tool. You guys are not doing as you should, and you're losing it. We're supposed to be setting an example for the world that people go, oh wow, look how loving and good and wonderful and devoted to their God this kingdom is. This group of people their God Yahweh? Who are they? Awesome. I wish I lived more like them. And they're saying, you're not doing that. And so you are falling to the same violence, the same, horror show that happens all over the world every day, and that's an interesting thing. I'm not gonna say, this is my own little interjection here. People like to say, well, God visits all sorts of horrors on people in the Old Testament. Is that a God that you want to believe in? This horrible, God who's just constantly punishing people and killing babies and stuff like that. If you actually look, and I'm not going to say that there's zero trace of ascribing to God that, and I will visit upon them these terrible things. However, what I will say is that if you kind of look at the terms of the covenant are, if you do this, if you live this way, if you follow my law, and if we have this relationship, they're terms of protection. And so if one side fails, how would God fail? Or how would God stop his side? He would reduce protection. And very little of what happens to the people of either the North or the South is anything that wouldn't happen to anybody minus protection. It's just violence and discord and awfulness all the time. Assyria comes in, they did it to every neighbor around Israel too, right? Babylon comes in and destroys the South, they did that to everybody else that they conquered too. So it needs to be remembered that however far we might take that in terms of ascribing to God that God punished them with this, a lot of what he's punishing with is just stuff that happens all the time. People just do terror now. Exactly.
Right now. Like a pandemic, right?
Or a pandemic, or Ukraine. These things.
Everything.
Yeah. What he's doing is he's saying this cosmos is a giant tornado, and I will simply remove your shelter if you don't keep this commandment. It's not like I'm bringing the tornado to you necessarily, but many people would argue that. But I think it's worth observing that that's a factor, even if it's not the whole story. It's definitely a factor. But anyway, so after all of this, Persia conquers Babylon and allows for the kind of reinstatement of something like, people coming back to their land, and that allows Israel and Judah to kind of reconstitute themselves a little bit. And they rebuild the temple that the Babylonians destroyed. So Solomon had built a temple, and it was destroyed by the Babylonians. David wanted to build the temple, but God, because of some naughty things that David did not allow him to. But Solomon was allowed to build according to David's plans, and he built a temple in Jerusalem. It's destroyed by the Babylonians, and then later, when they come back, when the Persians allow them, because the Persians were pretty lax, and they were like, you could have a temple, everybody else has a temple, go right ahead. So they build a second temple, and that institutes what we call Second Temple Judaism. This is very firmly the time in which Jesus is situated. This is Jesus' time, Second Temple Judaism. So the Second Temple period is also called the intertestamental period, because shortly after the Persian period starts, and they're allowed back in, Ezra, Nehemiah, names you recognize from the authors of from the books of the Bible. Ezra and Nehemiah are the people under whom a lot of the Judeans come back from the Babylonian exile during that period. They come back to the land. The Persians let them go back, and they build this second temple, and then the Bible stops. The Hebrew Bible stops, and that's it. And then in Catholic Bibles, you can attest to this. There are more texts that are written. There are other things that are written in the Second Temple period, but they are not generally in Bibles. A handful of them have been included in Catholic Bibles, and they're under the title Apocrypha. But when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, we found a ton more of things that were being written, of Second Temple texts. And the thing is that this is, a 4 or 5, maybe 500-year period, something like that, before Jesus is born. And these people were reading these texts there are comments, things that before we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, there were things that were in the New Testament. We're like, I don't really know what that means. Find the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you go, oh, they're quoting it. So the people in the New Testament were writing, they were absolutely reading texts from this Second Temple period, and we're still kind of learning more about some of the allusions that they were making, quotes that they were saying, things like that.
No, see,
So
that's
it's
what,
very interesting.
I'm sorry, that's what confuses me, is because back in that time, I thought the only ones that could read and write were the priests and not even kings.
That's sort of true. There's a lot of talk about that. People talk about people say, well, it seems very unlikely that a bunch of Galilean fishermen could write in this, fancy Greek. On the one hand, that's totally true. On the other hand, I would say a couple of things about it. One, I've heard some people who are not just like biblical scholars. There are other people who are what are called classicists, and they're like, I mean, it's okay. It's not that fancy Greek. So they're like, it depends. The people who are classicists, they know a lot about the language of the time. And a lot of classes, I've heard some classicists say, like, I mean, it's decent Greek. But Greek was also the lingua franca of the period after Alexander the Great kind of Hellenized. So Hellenization is the Greek word for Greece is Hellas. So when Alexander the Great just took over everything, Greek became the common language. Aramaic was the native language, but Greek was sort of like English is today. If you're Spanish and you go to Japan, you both might speak some English, right? So there's no reason, first of all, that a bunch of people wouldn't have a handle on some Greek.
Okay.
The other thing is that let's not forget that that a rabbi is by definition somebody who's interested in learning. And every disciple of a rabbi, it sort of self-selects for people who are interested in education, right?
Okay.
So even if you are raised a fisherman, you didn't stay a fisherman and you were interested in learning, right?
Okay.
So I think a lot of people forget that part. The other thing is that depending on your level of business interests and business involvement, there's a possibility that you were somewhat literate to begin with. John and James, disciples in the New Testament, sons of Zebedee, they were not just probably fishermen, they were also probably they were probably people who had like employees. It's the way that they're described, they probably had like a small fleet, which means that they were businessmen as much as they were fishermen. So it's entirely possible that they learned some Greek or to write.
Didn't they have scribes? And if someone
And they
would
did
know
have-
something,
yes.
they would bring it to a scribe.
Exactly. It's an amanuensis is a person who will write something down for you, and they were widely used.
Yes.
And that's the other thing is that on top of everything else, we're talking about a culture that prized education. So even if you didn't learn to write, somebody knew how to write. You probably knew a lot of stories. You probably were educated at least up to a certain age by somebody to at least know your Torah, to at least know, you know what I mean? So I think that sometimes people, and also there are plenty of people out there who are, I only got my bachelor's in my 30s. So for many, many years, I was already working and doing stuff, in fact, I think I had a couple of articles published before I even got my bachelor's degree. So it's entirely possible that, like I said, a person who's interested in doing something might, and people have different language abilities. People who have French, I know people who have degrees in French who I don't think much of they're way more fluent than this person over here. But I think this person sounds more native, and they just, in the moment they open their mouths, you can tell they're American. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
People have, it's a little sloppier than, well, I have a degree and you don't, or I'm literate and you aren't. You know what I mean? There are a lot of people who are literate but don't read well. There are a lot of people who read lightning speed. Anyway, so it's much more flexible, I think. Let's see. Yeah, so the synoptic, so the Gospels, let's move on. Okay. So the Gospels, and we'll wrap up after we just burn through this New Testament bit. Like I said, the narratives are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the Acts of the Apostles, and they tell about this late Second Temple Jewish movement under this rabbi named Jesus from up north, and about how he got killed by the establishment, and do you know what he was killed for? Do you know what his official? Do you know what it was for?
For blasphemy.
No, that's sort of why the Jewish authorities brought him in. Do you know what the official execution reason was for?
He says he's the king of the Jews.
Right. What's that?
They thought he was going to take over. He was too famous.
Right. When they put the placard above him, it said, you've probably seen this, INRI, which is Jesus Nazarenum Rex Judaeorum, which is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. So he was for sedition. He was killed for treason. Which is what he was applied to him, but there's no real evidence that he strongly made any seditious moves, but that's what they killed him for.
And they couldn't conceive of a king not being a ruler.
Right, exactly. Yeah, but what's interesting, somebody pointed out, they said that what's interesting is that they didn't really in any significant or strong way go after any of his followers. And that throws some interesting questions on exactly what the motivations were, why, and how, but that's probably for another time. The Acts of the Apostles follow the disciples and their disciples. Kind of starts off with everybody, and then it ends mostly talking about Paul. But then after that, the rest of the New Testament is mostly letters among the early communities. They were being set up. Most of them written by Paul. They are the earliest the earliest Christian writings we have are by Paul, and talking about both the beliefs, the developing theology, and also some of the problems in the early church. And then finally we have the Revelation written generally thought to be by John of Patmos, and the question of there seem to be multiple Johns, and who are they? It's the same problem. The multiple Marys and the multiple Johns are kind of tricky. Who's who? So, but the earliest stuff that we have is by Paul. The earliest of the Gospels is generally thought to be Mark, is the earliest one telling about Jesus. And then the latest gospel is generally thought to be John's gospel, and the last book of the Bible to be written is the Revelation of whoever the John was that wrote it. And so I guess I'll just say this one other thing is that right there, the word synoptic. When people talk about synoptic, syn meaning with, optic meaning eyeballs, or optic meaning seen. Synoptic means seen together. And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke all seem to share something like a common timeline, and they all seem to have relatively similar viewpoints and things that they're observing. John is nothing like any of the rest of them. It has a different timeline, and it has very different sort of language style and emphases, and so it is kind of the outlier, where the other three are called the synoptic gospels, because they kind of see things in the same way, so they're seen together, synoptic. So and then there's this little timeline that I sent that can kind of give you a little hints, and we'll kind of gradually get that more in our head, the timeline as we go, so that we can kind of be putting these ideas into where they happened. Hold on. I know. So, any questions before we call it a day?
Very interesting.
It's funky stuff. It's cool.
All the apostles were actually martyred except John.
That's the only one who, and there's an early tradition, yeah, there's an early tradition that says that he was bugged by people to please write something down. And that's then where we get the Gospel of John. And people have said that it's so different. And they're like, well, if he lived that long, he probably was aware of the circulation of the synoptic Gospels. And I don't know, they're like, but there's stuff in John that isn't in the others. And we're like, well, why would he recap stuff that's already in circulation?
Because they all have a different way to say things. It's like somebody writing a book and someone else writing a book. It's still the same thing, but different stories, slightly different. So you catch them all as a whole.
Yeah, it's very interesting. For example, John has only Matthew and Luke have a birth story. John does not, even though he starts. Like, it's funny because Mark starts at John the Baptist, and when Jesus is baptized, it says, "Today I have called you my son, and you whatever." Matthew and Luke, which come next in time in their writing, they start at Jesus' birth, and that's when he's the virgin birth, and he's all this. But then John, the one that comes latest, he starts at the beginning of everything. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was. So the earlier in time we are, the later you start, and the later in time the Gospels are, the earlier they start. It starts back at the beginning of time. So it's very interesting. The theology gets wider and wider in scope as you get later and later. So it's pretty interesting stuff.
Well, thank you. I enjoy it.
Oh, my pleasure.
There you go. I do read.
Yeah, well, you gave me a word today, I never heard.
Yeah.
By the way, the way that this is structured, sort of the way that the class is structured is that sort of bare bones of like, here's the ta, na, and ka, and then here's the narratives or whatever, is that we revisit it over and over and over again, giving a little bit more information each time. So like, if you think, well, all that structure, am I going to be able to remember that? You'll be told again. So, yes, there's not a lot to remember.
That's good.
There's not a lot to remember.
Yeah, I found it very interesting. Basically, I learned from Kimberly Gibbard.
Oh, did you
She is a
really?
Messianic Jew. And, she's proud of it. And,